In part 2 of Chapter 14, we'll look at the following: Africa in transition and Southeast Asia in the era of the spice trade. Let's begin. The gold trade in southern Africa piqued the interest of the Portuguese, who allied themselves with the native Shona dynasty, known as the Muni Mutapa. This alliance initially was profitable, but in time the Muni Mutapa grew tired of the Portuguese presence. In South Africa, the Dutch established a foothold in the region and began to settle. The Dutch inhabitants became known as Boers, and their language, a dialect of Dutch, evolved into what is known as Afrikaans. The difference between the Portuguese and Dutch presence was a matter of integration. The Dutch, for example, settled along the Cape area and into the interior of South Africa. They became part and parcel of South African society. The Portuguese had no interest in having colonial settlements to actually have a Portuguese presence over and above what they could get in terms of resources to bring back to Portugal. They did not have any long-term vision of actually integrating and socializing with the Shona people. The slave trade was flourishing long before Europeans came to Africa. In fact, Africans participated in slavery, and when Islam was introduced to sub-Saharan Africa, slavery became an economic necessity. Slaves were used for a variety of reasons, from household servants to laborers to concubines, and initially, Europeans used them strictly for domestic duties. But with the discovery of the New World and an environment conducive to growing sugarcane and molasses is the key ingredient in rum, the need for slaves rose exponentially. More and more slaves were transported to meet the growing demand for labor. The high mortality rates along the Middle Passage, the sea route from Africa to the Americas, also fueled the growing demand. The slave trade, historians argue, would not have been possible to the extent it was without the assistance of local African intermediaries, serving as middlemen, facilitating the sale of their own people to the slave traders. Roughly 20% of the slaves were children, which led to declining populations in some areas, while in others, such as West Africa, a degree in economic growth was actually fueled by the slave trade, which also brought new technologies, such as firearms and staples from the New World, such as the yucca plant. Southeast Asia in the era of the spice trade. The spice trade brought Europe to Southeast Asia. Islam had slowly crept into the region, and by the 16th century was the predominant religion. Of all the European powers, it was the Dutch, and specifically the Dutch East India Company, also known as the VOC, who controlled the spice trade in the region. The Dutch East India Company possessed a great deal of wealth, and in attempting to consolidate power in Southeast Asia, specifically the Malay Peninsula and the Indonesian archipelago, began to exert their influence through monopolizing the pepper and clove industries. But in the grand scheme, the European powers focused more on the periphery of Southeast Asia rather than the mainland. Religion was important to Southeast Asians. Buddhism sprung up from the Indian subcontinent and moved eastward with the flow of goods and people. But Islam would come to surpass all other religions, including Christianity, in the region. Religious beliefs affected society in several ways, including providing religious education and an ethical and moral code of behavior, which affected the average person's worldview. Apart from religion, changes in economic systems, agricultural to commercial, affected the time-honored tradition of farming. Southeast Asia, compared with other mainland Asian countries, show that they were, generally speaking, more prosperous than their neighbors. 3 factors explain this: good climate, with plenty of rainfall, rich soil along the various river deltas, such as the Mekong, and, when this is impossible, land that is close to volcanic activity due to the rich nutrients in volcanic ash, and a relatively low population. This concludes part 2 of chapter 14.